All right, guys, how's it going? Haven't been live for a little bit. I've been having sparser streams lately, but it's because I've been so busy. Excuse me. I've always been busy, but there's a difference between like a routine busy and a chaotic busy. I've been fucking chaotic busy. Not necessarily more busy, but a lot of variables, a lot of ups and downs going on lately. So let's see if I can get this in the right spot. Okay. We will have Biblio99 on today. You guys probably recognize him in chat. He actually, I think he quite enjoys the channel, enjoys the streams. But he is a student who I can't remember what field. We will obviously get to that, but I think we're going to talk about sort of. He recently wrote a paper, did some research around internet echo chambers and sort of the concept of open mindedness, and all that fun stuff. Francesco Maltoni. Being on time is a good virtue signal. You were damn right. Which scorns zealots and critical social justice for its presumed whiteness. Damn, that's some woke shit, dude. That's think you're ahead of the curve, man. You are ahead of the curve. Much more ahead of me. Colin Taylor, hello, my friend. Uh, hope you guys are all doing wonderful today. I'm looking forward to this one. I like having people on. Don't do it enough. Should be a fun time. So without a further ado, I think we're good to bring him in now. Yo, Biblio, you there? looks like all right. Looks like he's still
Give
in.
me
Oh, sorry.
give me 1 second. Hold on.
Okay,
All
no
right.
problem, dude.
All right, let's see here. All right, what's up?
All right, man. Good to have you in here, dude. So you said recently you kind of you were telling me you did some was it some research or you just wrote a paper that you were especially interested in and sort of internet echo chambers, is that right?
Yeah, so I guess for a little bit of background, I guess my day job you could say is I'm a lawyer and I'm also a graduate student in philosophy. And I've been sort of recently really interested in this question of what we believe, how we come to believe it, and once we can answer that question, the sort of uh, the sort of question that falls out of that of like what are the political and ethical implications of that. And so I've been looking a lot at like open-mindedness and particularly how our open-mindedness and how our sort of the intersection of ethics and epistemology works out, like when we're talking about like discourse on the internet, being on Twitter, being on YouTube, things like that. I mean, it's interesting to me, I guess, just because I do some of that. um and it's sort of something that's come up a bit on your streams as well, so I thought
Yeah.
it'd be a good topic for us to sort of get into, to put it mildly.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's yeah, to say the least, I think communication and sort of a theory of connection and relationship and how we can communicate in a number of contexts, right? Politically, relationally, those things definitely really interest me, and it's because I don't think, after thousands of years, we have I don't think we've really done a terribly good job at progressing, right? So things are okay, right? Language is okay. I think the one of the things that I kind of relate to is that people say like for how bad things aren't that bad, and I actually think that's true. In a number of ways. So especially pertaining to the issues with language and communication and discourse, um, things aren't very good, but they're not that bad either, right? We can communicate. We have ways of mediating certain conflicts and things. Yet nonetheless, it seems like we don't make a lot of progress, if that makes sense, right? So progression itself as a sociological thing with communication doesn't seem to be doing too well. And I'm sure as a lawyer, you may feel that as well, and just being on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it feels a lot of times like you're just spinning your wheels. A lot of times. I mean, I have a Twitter. I'm not on there a ton. Um, you're probably on there more than I am, but it is a weird sort of issue when you're on there and you sort of notice, like, once it the idea comes to your mind of like, well, I could be in this sort of bubble, and Twitter is the sort of place, or YouTube is the sort of place where these things are reinforced. um that's all you can ever see on these platforms. An interesting question, I think, though, is like, it's not all bad. Like, I think you're exactly right, where it's not necessarily worse than it's ever been.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there have been plenty of examples of you know, uh, incredible propaganda efforts to sort of affect public discourse and things like that throughout history. Um, and I think, things like Twitter are sort of one iteration of that. They're a sort of modern contemporary iteration of that. Um, But you see all sorts of examples. Like, for instance, like, I think a lot of people tend to think that like Twitter and YouTube and these sorts of things are like polarizing us more than ever before. Um, and it's interesting because I think in a certain sense, like, it feels very polarizing. Um, but I was like reading some history, like, on the law side, and like, was reading about, like, right when the US was founded, and Congress was essentially so politicized that they just um ended the Supreme Court's term for like 2 years, right when the
Hmm.
country was founded. And I'm like, could you ever imagine something like that happening now? You'd think it was like the end of the country or something like that. So there are all sorts of examples of like extreme polarization and stuff like that. um so I definitely agree. Like, I don't think that it's necessarily worse than it's ever been, but I think that, like, the internet gives us a unique opportunity to try to understand what's going on. Um, and so, like, I'm getting a question here. Do we consider Twitter public discourse, or is it fragmented? I mean, that's a good question
That
in and
is.
of itself. Like, what do we think of Twitter? Like, is it public discourse? Is it not public discourse? I don't know. What do you think of that?
No, I mean, yeah, I think really any forum in any capacity, right? Whether that be on the internet or we don't even think of forums being. At least I'm Gen Z. I'm the first generation Gen Z, so I'm like the old Gen Z. But nonetheless, I am Gen Z, and I think forums are just internet stuff. It's internet places where people can talk, compared to the historical definition of forums being like an actual physical thing with people. But no, in any
Right.
forum, probably. Like I think that's probably fair to say that Twitter is public discourse. It's I think, and this doesn't exist just on Twitter, right? This is something that kind of confuses me sometimes. I know. Well, I mean, it doesn't really confuse me, but at the same time, I don't think it gets at the core of it. I've seen some YouTube videos. Why is Twitter so toxic? I'm like, guys, have you guys been to fucking Reddit, or have you been to it's like no, it's
Hmm.
everywhere. It's toxic. You can simulate these sort of things behind a screen, and there is distance with simulations, right? And when there is such a huge distance, you lose that innate human connection. Like it's one of those things that with communication that kind of bugs me, and I try to avoid is, would I talk this way to this person if I was in person with them? And of course, before I was conscious of this earlier in my life, when I was like in high school and shit, oh yeah, I would say way more inflammatory things than I would have said rather than in person. And I think even before I started getting all into philosophy and theory and stuff, I kind of had an issue with that, and I just decided to be nice to most people, and I think that works pretty well, and I think the internet needs more of it. I think in general, I don't think we can ever have too much niceness, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, on the internet, that it's cynicism is the mode of communication, if that makes sense, and it exists everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I just to pick up on something that you mentioned, like, I think Twitter is interesting. I've been reading a lot about like how Twitter essentially like gamifies our discourse. And it does this, and by gamify, what I would mean, I guess, is that like it sort of changes the goals of discourse, right? So like where you ordinarily like in person, right? So you like drew this really interesting distinction between like, well, you have discourse in person and you have discourse like over the internet. And you're probably going to be nicer to people if you apply the norms of in-person discourse to internet discourse. Um, and I think part of the reason why we make that distinction is like, well, Twitter kind of changes the rules of the game, right? Like Twitter, it's about likes, it's about like being visible in some way. Um, and so once you sort of start to internalize those changes, it's no longer really about like meeting people halfway in a way that you could like come to understand their side of some argument, right? It's
Mhm.
about like, maybe causing some outrage or getting likes or getting retweeted or something like that. Um, and so I mean, it's an interesting question of like, well, does that make it not discourse, or is that just like really bad discourse? Um,
Yeah,
on
no,
the
no,
other
no.
hand,
You're definitely you speak like a law nerd. I'm a political science. I was a political science major, so like
mm,
80% of political science majors, at least their goal is to go to law school. So it's a
sure,
lot of definitional sort of I
yeah,
guess, and I mean philosophy, analytical philosophy is definitely concerned with this. A lot of pinning down definitions. No, but that is a good question, right? Is that discourse or is it not? I'd probably fall in the ballpark that it is. It's just really bad discourse. It's a very weak form of discourse. It's a new form of discourse that, like, think about it. Like, human civilization has existed for such a long time now, and I don't think we had letters, we had written text, and then we had the creation of cell phones and or not, sorry, not cell phones, but telephones and radios, and we haven't it's a new thing, right, to communicate outside of persons, right? And
right,
that's yeah, that definitely poses questions that I don't even think a lot of people have talked about, right? A lot. We have some, I would guess, some later 20th century theory on ideas of simulations of things, right? Of entertainment and stuff, but communication via like the internet and even like phone calls and stuff like that. That's interesting. At least I'm not familiar with a lot of philosophical questions relating to that. I'm sure people have done it and have written about it in the 20th century and even before, but I'm unaware.
yeah. I mean, it's sort of a new thing. So like, one of my real interests in on the philosophy end of things is epistemology, and like the field is definitely changing in this regard. So like, um, for folks who aren't familiar, like epistemology is just the study of knowledge, right? Like what is knowledge? How do we get to knowledge? And for a long time, epistemology was sort of dominated by what's typically called like analytic epistemology, which, as you can imagine, is a sort of like drier form of inquiry that's sort of trying to figure out like what is the definition of knowledge, like what is the definition of, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a belief to be knowledge, things like that. But that's really hard to do. And there are all sorts of like really technical problems with trying to come up with a definition like that. Um, and so recently, like, there's been a shift in the field, and that shift has been towards what's called virtue epistemology. And it's a lot like virtue ethics. Instead of trying to come up with a definition, instead, people are trying to figure out, like, well, what is a good knower? What sorts of things do good knowers do? Um, what are bad knowers in even, and what sorts of virtues and vices do these kinds of people have? Um, and so, like, to your point, there's only so much you can do with definitions, and I think this has been like a really great move in the field, um, because we can ask like far more interesting questions, I think, right? And we can ask like, well, how would a virtuous knower, if we even want to use that term. Like, how would that person interact with people on Twitter or something like that? Um, and like, I don't know. I mean, I think that like for like it's interesting because it's there are so many different sides of the coin. I'm like, we could talk about so many different things right now, but um, you know, just the question of like, or just noting that like it's not all good, it's not all bad. And what are the sorts of good things that we could do on these platforms is kind of an interesting question in its own right. It's a more practical question, right?
Hmm.
Um, and like for instance, like one of these questions that's really interested me, especially like when I've been watching your streams, is like um the discourse between like internet leftists and how like sometimes very hostile they are to each other.
Hmm.
And if there's just like a better way to go about it.
Yeah.
I mean, have you seen like I wonder like what in your mind like uh you know you would say like underlies that? Is it just like is it
S-
something platform related? Is it something like doctrinal or something like that? Like what do you think of
I
that?
I mean, the first thing that would come to my mind, and I tend to do this with a lot of things, like it's ideology.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm too quick to come to that conclusion, but again, like the Zizek in me, sort of, I have kind of a habit of seeing like ideology in everything, right? And I think at least on Twitter, and when you get onto political Twitter, that's exactly I think what's going on, right? It's a and it's different. There's different levels. Some people are gunning for the vanguard position of their specific ideology, right? You're a Ryan Knight, and you're trying to end the DNC establishment and all that fun and kind of virtuous stuff, but it's in a really cringed, horrible way that won't work. But nonetheless, and then you have people who they have a sort of mechanical, I want to say almost a very neoliberal outlook on how to
Mhm.
facilitate their own ideological beliefs and how to influence. And that's what it is. It's a game of influence. Can I convert this person to Marxism? And it's not even like, can I convert them? Can I get them to see the sort of political and economic ends and goals of this ideology? It's that, can I almost in place, this is a really huge contradiction that I see, and it's one indicative of being Western subjects, Western liberals, if you ask me, is that can I like place this identity on them, this sort of aestheticized notion. And when I do this, when I put this, and they're actually not wrong here, and this is kind of the problem, when I put this aesthetic on them, from there, their psyche will be molded to a point where they can accept things like, oh, Medicare for all is good.
Mhm.
X is good, Y is good. Problem is again, it turns into a circular form of ideology that's not critical of itself, and then it breaks down. Right. So maybe I'm a little bit of a dualist here, right? You accept something totally, or you become completely cynical. I don't mean that for everyone. I'm saying that that's how
Right.
political discourse takes hold on the internet, especially on Twitter. And it's to try to be critical. I think that we should be critical of what we are not only thinking, what we think is right, but what we are fundamentally doing aside from our intent, right? This is the big problem is
Mhm.
like, oh, people just mean to do this. They're trying to, like, um, you know, what Ryan Knight is trying to. This is I see this all the time with like guys. Because you go on Twitter, Ryan Knight cracks me up. I absolutely love this dude's fucking Twitter account. He kind of like has a special place in my heart. People think I hate him. I don't hate the guy. I love him like I love Alex Jones, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
And
you love to hate him.
yeah, no,
It's one
it's
of
like I don't know. I don't. It's not even hate. It's like it's a secret respect because it's so fucking
Mhm.
cringe, and it's such a good way. Like it's an art form. I respect the fuck out of it. I think it's
Well,
beautiful.
didn't
But
yeah, I mean, didn't Alex Jones didn't he say that in court one time?
I,
Maybe
I'm
this is
sure
just
he
totally
did.
aside,
I'm sure
like that he was like, "Oh, I'm a performance artist" or something like
Alex
that.
Jones is 100% worse than Ryan Knight. But yes, that's exactly. Alex Jones said a lot of. Oh, he put some families through a lot of shit, and he's a pretty big piece of shit in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, I respect the performance art that goes on regarding certain ideological positions and aesthetics. And um, I think the goal is to, again, look at what you are fundamentally doing aside from your core intent. This is things that psychoanalysis is a little bit interested in. It's like trying to understand the total nature of what's kind of happening beyond intent, right? In some ways,
Right.
and no one thinks like that. And I can't blame them, right? You can't blame them. The only way you can kind of enter those questions and those frameworks, in my mind, at least this is how I did it. Like, I just started reading some philosophy, and it
Hmm.
kind of just it kind of really just, not to sound a little corny, it expands your subjectivity, expands your mind, and it creates new ways on how to think, not what to think. This is important. It's not what to think. Sure, thinking certain things. There are some things that are correct. There are some things that are wrong. We can argue about those things. People thinking more correct things is good. But I think what's more powerful is teaching people how to think about things. And that is a whole other field. It's a whole other bag of worms that doesn't really get contended with because, again, the goal of ideology isn't to influence necessarily modes of thought, but content of thought, right? It's I mean, in some ways they want to facilitate a way that you can think. But really at the end of the day, it's the goal is really to get you to think certain things and act certain ways, right?
Right. No, I mean, I think all of that is is directly spot on. Like, and I think a lot of it comes back to like, and again, like you mentioned it yourself, but it's a very sort of Western idea of like, you know, I mean, I guess more specifically like an enlightenment idea of, how do we arrive at truth? Well, we go out into the marketplace of ideas, and then we sort of, you know, do battle with our arguments, and then like the best argument wins. And I think like first off, unfortunately, that's just like not the way that that's not the way that like psychology works.
Hmm.
Um, like there's a lot of evidence. I was working on a different paper just yesterday about how, it's like a critique of John Stuart Mill's freedom of speech, right? He has this marketplace of ideas um, model that he uses to sort of model what our free speech um, laws and policies should be. Um, but his underlying picture of like the psychology of a person is just like not really all that supported by the actual evidence.
Right.
And of course, I don't expect him to have access to contemporary psychology uh, or psychological data or anything like that. Um, but I mean, it's really important to kind of update our idea, right? Because if we normalize the idea of, or if we normalize the idea that coming to the truth is essentially a matter of like being combative and doing these sorts of things, then like people being combative in discourse is going to be sort of normalized. And so when people take advantage of that, like an Alex Jones might, um, people don't notice so much, and it makes it all the more effective. Um,
Yeah, you know what's funny talking about this? One huge contradiction I see is that something that I talk about, I've been personally kind of accused. I talk about like the importance of actually facilitating sort of some like healthy relationship.
mhm.
Aside from fucking politics, I don't like aside from talking about policy, politics, the goal is to sort of bridge and build a little bit of connection there, right? And that's actually more important than anything. It makes a bit way bigger influence than trying to convince someone that people deserve health care or some shit. But one of the biggest things that I see is I've been kind of accused of like, oh, so like oh, just be nice to people and shit. That's some lib shit. I'm like, no, actually, like, ironically, the lib shit argument, if you ask me, the lib thing to do is to sort of partake in a ritualized warfare of discourse, right? Like you just said, like debate, like that is a very liberal ideal. And the problem is that people are emotional beings. They have internal responses that even they can't control, and sometimes they're not even aware of. Right? Again, something that I think psychoanalysis does well is sort of getting at the root a little bit of this. And in my mind, the ironic lib thing is to partake in this warfare like debate discourse, and and it just doesn't work very well. And the one thing to kind of fix that is that can probably help is building some relationship, being a little nice, not understanding, understanding that we're not all that crazy different, in a lot of ways, um, and it's like it's funny. There's that's what I see online a lot is that there is such a rejection of like on a political level of what would we call it uh not, I want to say like centrism, but it's deeper than that.
Mhm.
It's not centrism. It's oh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Not togetherness, or help me out here if you can.
Community?
Maybe not community. I had a specific word in mind, but
Solidarity? I don't know. I'm throwing
a
words
little bit
out.
solidarity, but sort of
Something in the
like,
middle.
yeah, something carefully sitting in the middle, but that's not actually what's
Mhm.
what's what's happening, right?
Right.
It's like if anything, how stuff happens today isn't sitting in the middle, right? So a lot of people think that they go on the internet, they're very much principled in their approach and things. They're like, oh, listen, I stand for my principles. I don't take shit. I don't sit and just like I'm okay with everyone. I take a principled stand. It's like, okay, you think that's what you're doing, but that's really not what you're doing, right?
Right.
If anything, you're alienating more. And it doesn't mean you got to be nice to everyone. It doesn't mean you got to be an artificial person. If you disagree with someone, you don't say something. But it's like you got to understand that again, the current mode of communication on the internet isn't. Even in the United States, in a liberal context, we think that like the liberal position is like a togetherness, right? We're all okay, and certainly there's some institutional things like that, like how government operates is sort of in the judiciary and stuff. It's to facilitate conflict in a lot of ways in a healthy way without like fucking killing each other. But nonetheless, it also facilitates a verbal and like a sort of communicative warfare that goes on via debate mechanisms. And we're not very good at analyzing all of those things in a complete clear package. And the internet definitely isn't good at even potentially facilitating those things. That's why I kind of, a lot of people. One thing that kind of irks me a little bit because it's just so wrong is like you don't need to be like you don't need to read or do this. I'm like, dude, the amount of information that seems to only exist in text is just unreal, and it sucks that we can't quite the internet can't transform that way of thought or that way of approaching information. We haven't been able to facilitate that on the internet, right? And we can only find certain larger ideas elaborated on in text form, right? We have online PDFs and shit, but yeah, I don't know, man. I think a lot of the stuff, not to sound like your corny librarian, a lot of the stuff though that we're dealing with, it's going to be found in a lot of sort of philosophical and historical texts. I don't think we say the internet is some emancipatory information apparatus, and it is in a lot of ways, but it's not completely.
Yeah, I mean, dude, so many good points. And just as an aside, like, your point about, like the justice system and all of that, and like absolutely 100%, it is sort of regulated warfare. I mean, I can tell you, like, when I was in law school and I was taking classes about you know, how to put a trial on, um, you know, I would say 80% of it maybe had to do with how to influence the jury or the judge or whatever it was, right? Like how to retain your credibility, how to make sure that you were as persuasive as possible. Um, Very little of it actually went into like, well, how do you develop the facts? How do you communicate them in the most effective way, even if, they might not be as necessarily beneficial to you as they might otherwise be. Um, but I mean, it's again, it's a sort of, and it's all very much, I think, based on that sort of enlightenment notion, like you brought up, of the sort of debate as like combat leading to truth. Um, and it's funny because like just I've been reading Mill recently just for that paper, and I actually really like Mill. Like um I don't always agree with the sort of more recent criticisms of Mill from the left. I think,
Ha-
you know,
I don't mean to interject. Have you seen a lot of the spicy stuff with John Stuart Mill and Matt McManus and Jacobin?
oh, oh, dude, I don't use Twitter a lot, but I use Twitter to follow him, and his stuff on Mill is like fantastic, I think.
Dude,
Um,
I get insanely sick. Okay, here's okay. Might be a radical take. I don't think that. I think if you're going to talk about a thinker, a philosopher, a writer, and if you're going to critique them, and you don't read them, you ought to be very careful. Very, very careful. I don't know. I think that's kind of a fucking radical, it might be a radical notion. I think it's pretty common sense, but I notice it's so clear, especially with people who would consider themselves explicit Marxists, whatever, they will critique a lot of liberal thinkers, and it's so abundantly clear they have never read them. I actually I think it was last stream, I opened up Locke's Second Treaty of Government, and I'm not a Lockean in any sense of the way. Like, matter of fact,
sure, yeah,
I'm very anti-Locke in a lot of ways. But I'm like, you
right.
motherfuckers clearly have never read Locke. So Locke talks about like sort of what necessitates property and like value
Hmm.
of something in a way. You can tell there are some liberal influences even in people like Marx with people like Locke. Locke emphasized a lot of labor with with like uh the legitimacy of like property in a lot of ways. Like if you put labor into
Absolutely.
something like that, that's what and that is like if you ask me, those are some small fissures that go into a lot of early Marxian development and thought. And so like what we miss here and what especially what Matt McManus was trying to make is like we ignore the dialectical process in which sort of ideology and philosophy come together, and there is a process in which it develops. So getting to one part of sort of a central philosophy that you disagree with to completely throw it out the window is ungodly stupid, and it really is. And I don't know if you probably didn't see. I guess I'll for people in chat as well. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. I read his book Continuity and Rupture, but J. Mafwad Paul, he's a one of the very few one of the very few Marxists in academia, and he thinks a big proponent of sort of the Marxist Leninist Maoist position within Marxism. And he essentially just and like a lot of other people who saw the headline of Matt's article on John Stuart Mill, was he a socialist?
Yeah.
The headline was supposed to catch, like, it was supposed to bring people in. The article isn't like, is John Stuart Mill a socialist? It's more like, hey, like throughout the end development of John Stuart Mill, what has happened is he, like even people like Adams, have seen sort of there's issues and there's really interesting developments happening in the grounds of socialism, and that even liberal thinkers were interested in these things and not necessarily in a combative sense. So really the entire goal of the article was just to say, hey, look, even this liberal thinker, he has issues with how property develops and how capitalism develops. And they recognized these issues and they were interested in it. Oddly enough, again, Matt McManus points out that the right ignores this, and it's probably purposeful. And,
Hmm.
it's probably worth reading these people just because they're a part of the philosophical canon. Doesn't mean we should accept everything that they say. Instant. That was literally the entire point. Instant, just online Twitter catharsis. Like, oh, now Jacobin is they like slavers and they like liberals and all that shit. I'm like, yeah, like I can't imagine approaching. And like I said, J. Mafwad Paul, I don't have a problem with him personally at all. I read his book Continuity and Rupture, and it was pretty good at explaining how dialectics works in a Marxist
Hmm.
sense. But like, I couldn't believe. I was like dumbfounded. He was like, "What a stupid fucking article this is," and stuff like that. And he said the same thing about like Mark Fisher being a middling thinker. And if you think Mark Fisher isn't all that great, that's totally fine. I mean, I think a lot of people who are quite into the same realm of theory that I am, they kind of have that critique of Mark Fisher. He's just like an articulator, and that's fair. And so they're like, I prefer Jameson, who actually came up with these ideas. But like,
Mhm.
if you look at philosophy as like, oh, this person's shit, this person's good, that is the weirdest. Like, I almost can't help. Like, I can't believe this, the dude's a fucking philosophy professor. Like, I get that. I get that it is a common thing even within philosophy to sort of again engage in this warfare like system of, oh, putting this person down and their ideas down. But it's like I think that is like the worst form of philosophy. Of course, there's other thinkers who think this as well. Not to make it legitimate because of that, but I quite agree with people like even like Deleuze has talked about it like that. That's critique without creation or just mindless
Mhm.
cynicism. It's the worst form of philosophy that exists, and I can't believe I had an interaction with someone like J. Mouthwad Paul, who's a really respected thinker, especially among Marxists. And it was the most dumb shit. And then he backtracked and he said, he's like, I'm talking about, he essentially, whenever I think Matt, and even I tweeted him, like, you didn't even, like, it's clear, like, either you didn't read the article or you're just completely talking about something separate than the article.
Right.
He essentially was just like, oh, after I said, I was like, dude, like, Matt's not talking about, like, putting John Stuart Mill into the socialist category and stuff. That's not what he's talking about. He's like, oh, well, I'm talking about socialists who do this. I'm like, one, that's not what the fuck was talked about in the article. Then you have a problem elsewhere.
Right.
You have a problem on Twitter or other left wing thinkers who are maybe potentially a little bit easy on people like John Stuart Mill. But it's just really weird the overly ideological combativeness and a lack to actually contend with the direct thinking of people. It's unfucking real to me, truly, and it's I don't even really like it. Used to be unbearable. I find it more funny now. I guess it's my way of coping with it.
Right.
I think it's my yeah, but
You gotta at some point you gotta just laugh. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
but yeah. Can I just get I didn't catch that name. I've got some folks asking in my chat for what was his name? Paul?
J. Mafwad Paul. So don't I hope no one like goes and fucking spams him or don't. Absolutely not. Like I think I'm sure he's a very nice guy. Very definitely reading his book Continuity and Rupture. He's not a fucking idiot at all, which is what surprised me most of all. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
um,
if there's anything to take away from this particular strand of the discussion, it's just read the book.
yeah, yeah,
Don't
exactly.
don't yell at the dude.
It's
Read the
that
book.
very intelligent people will still approach. They will take a mode of philosophy in such horridly terrible ways. Ironically, I really think that this idea of the combative nature of Marxism versus liberalism or liberalism versus conservatism or any of these things, that is a liberal
Mhm.
notion at the end of the day. I really think that,
The
like,
problem with Locke/Hobbes and Mill is that they keep
sorry,
the
just got to
artificial
donate.
hierarchy of humans class/race, whereas Spinoza/Marx/Lacan/Fanon/Rawls expose it as a fraud and dismantle it.
Sorry, just got a donation
No
from David.
worries.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the $10. But we can maybe get into that. But I'll finish sort of what I was saying. It's that you know people like these notions of ideology versus ex ideology, idea versus certain idea. In my mind, I think that's something that's an enlightenment ideal in a lot of ways. It's a sort of liberal ideal in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that we should probably get rid of, right? This is why I'll hear people on the internet, especially coming from like an explicit sort of ideological Marxist lens, is that they will say Deleuze, someone like Deleuze, or a lot of 20th century philosophers, they are liberalization of Marxism, and I think that's so wrong. Like I really like Marxist thinkers of the past were far more liberal than people like in the most
Right,
definitional
right.
in the most definitional context, far more liberal than Deleuze and a lot of even people like I would consider like Baudrillard. They almost in
Mhm.
a way flip the entire foundations of liberalism, the core foundations of liberalism, far beyond political ideology and theory on sort of semantics and discourse. If they flip it on their head. Um, and so I find that's a huge contradiction as well that comes up on Twitter, and it that's again gets at the root of it. It's sort of how ideology functions as a warfare sort of system, and I'm not a big fan. But to respond to David, he says the problem with Locke, Hobbes, and Mill is that they keep the artificial hierarchy of humans class relation, whereas well yeah that's a big that's a big problem, right? And then Spinoza, Marx, Lacan, Fanon, Rawls expose it as a fraud and dismantle it. Yeah, no, that's right. I think a lot of later liberals, and again, this is something that gets ignored when we talk about liberalism. The later sort of development of liberalism, they start to really contend with that, I think. Like, they start to really contend with, oh, we're not accounting for a huge group of people who are kind of just left behind a little bit in the most abstract material lens. And a lot of people think about that.
Absolutely.
They're like, oh shit, man, we're defending a sort of hierarchical structure on how things go. If anything, liberalism certainly, and even capitalism, it worked at the time, especially early liberalism and capitalism. It actually was a flattening out, more so than sort of the traditional roles of feudal society and stuff. So in many ways, capitalism, and Zizek's really good at pointing this out, capitalism emancipates in a lot of ways. And ironically, that is kind of a problem in some ways, right? It can kind of divert our attention away. This is why something,
Right,
like we pay attention to social emancipation, like, women's rights, and stuff
Mhm.
like that, and that's great, right? But capitalism's good at that. It really is. Like, let's be real. They are good on a very social, not an economic material level, but a very good. It's very good at flattening out those sort of hierarchies as we see today. But of course, to flatten out hierarchies, right, and in the most universal sense, that involves a sort of economic context, and that's where capitalism is horrid at in today's form. So of course, again, I think, and a lot of other people think, the form is to move past and try to find ways to move towards new economic systems and modes of governing and living, right? Past capitalism. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, dude. I mean, all excellent points. I feel like, you know, you've pretty much hit the nail on the head here. And like just like I was saying, I don't necessarily agree with all the criticisms of Mill. I mean, there
Mhm.
is a lot you could criticize about him,
For sure.
for sure. But there's also like with any sort of thinker that huge, like there's so much you can learn. And
I
and
know.
just at the very least, the man was an amazing writer. Like his his actual works, like I actually have it right here with me on my desk at the moment, but like I've On Liberty, Utilitarianism, and the Subjection of Women. I mean, like the man was writing in the mid 1800s, and like it's very understandable. Like it's down to
Right.
earth. You get what he's saying. At the very least, we can just sort of look at it as a way of doing philosophy that isn't sort of bogged down by like later analytic methods or any sort of like, I mean, there's some ambiguities, but I think for the most part, I mean, he was a great writer at the very least. Um, for sure,
Yeah.
there are serious problems with hierarchies and things like that, but I think you're exactly right. I mean, if you look at later liberals like, John Rawls, still some stuff to criticize him about
Mhm.
for sure, but as you sort of indicated, like he's trying much harder to grapple with that sort of inherent hierarchy in the system. Um, yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting on my end. I find most of this stuff, m-
Now that
philosophy at
Amazon
least,
HQ2 is
really
being built and
interesting
they
when
are
it's
making
put
their
into
own
that
apartments,
dialectic
how close
context,
do you
right?
think
So
you are
like
of
some of my
corporations owning
favorite
cities?
courses were history of philosophy courses, like that I took in undergrad, where you learn about Descartes, and then you learn about Leibniz, and then you learn about Locke and Hume, and then you go to Kant, and then you sort of learn about the give and take of these ideas as they developed. Um, and that's kind of almost value neutral in like that early modern context. Um, but I mean, look, if you went a little bit further in history and you look at people like Locke and their political ideas, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, there's no way Marx does not read Locke and
Right. Yeah.
incorporate those ideas either, affirmatively or negatively into his theory. And I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in Marxism by any means,
Mhm.
but my understanding is that you are kind of exactly right, and that for Locke at least, property is made possible by labor. And so you have that sort of strand straight into Marx. And so it is something that is, I think, pretty disappointing to see that people are, not trying to understand where the ideas came from. I mean, there's
Right.
always going to be a certain level of like, you can't read everything, right? And if you're trying to understand Marx, there's a lot to read already. Um, at the same
Outside
time,
the Communist Manifesto, that is.
right, right, right. But yeah, I mean, look, it's like, I think you're gonna have a hard time understanding Marx if you don't have an understanding of, or at least a cursory understanding, if you don't at least try to read through a little bit of Locke, a little bit of Mill, and a little bit of these thinkers that are, I mean, not for nothing, but Mill is essentially a contemporary of Marx.
Yeah,
And
in a
he
lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah, and he does write um about socialism explicitly in some cases, and was, I think, doesn't really get enough credit for being a more progressive liberal in that sense. But you do have people like Matt McManus who are sort of trying to remedy that, I think, by bringing attention to that sort of strand of his argumentation.
Yeah, how
Um,
it's not good enough just to completely reject an entire sort of area of philosophy and just throw it out without actually carefully dissecting what's going on, right? That's
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, like, I mean, to tie it back to an earlier point that we were talking about, I think that a lot of this does come out of, I mean, I guess I could get back to the actual critique here and say, like we've been saying, like this sort of enlightenment idea of the sort of combat in the marketplace of ideas. Um, it's a very, I don't want to say dehumanizing, because in a certain respect it is sort of humanistic.
Mhm.
But it is a sort of dehumanizing in the respect that, like, trying to like articulate this in a correct way,
Sure,
but
yeah, no problem.
um like it sort of just unifies our conception of what people are, right? So like
Mhm.
people, and you see it across the board, right? You see it in political philosophy like Mill, but you also see it in like economics, like, I mean, the idea of like the rational, self-interested individual. I mean, these are just sort of assumptions that we make that fall out of Mill and Locke and these sort of Enlightenment thinkers. Um, they have very little basis in reality. I think it's come up. I vaguely remember on one of your streams economics coming up, and you know, it's like it's only as good as the models. And there's a reason that at a certain point, you know, uh, behavioral economics, right? The idea that, people have a bounded rationality. They're not always rational. They're not always self-interested. They don't always follow those rules. There's a reason that sort of took hold and upended economics. Um, and I think, like, you could make those same critiques for people believing and knowledge, and people in the, if you want to say, marketplace of ideas. I mean,
Mhm.
people aren't always going to, they're not always going to have the energy, to engage in a sort of debate to get at the truth. They're not always going to want to get at the truth. I think a big part of like why people end up in echo chambers is because it's like more comfortable to be in an echo chamber. Um, I think that's um, a big reason why people end up in bubbles. So like, I guess in a technical sense, right, we can draw a distinction between echo chambers and what are called epistemic bubbles, by saying like the bubble is kind of when you just sort of surround yourself with like-minded people.
Right.
And that's just sort of natural, right? That just happens. If you're on Twitter, right, to go back to the Twitter example, like, you're gonna follow people that you kind of agree with. Um, as a sort of aside, I've had a really weird Twitter experience because I'm not on there a lot, so I
Mhm.
don't have a ton of followers or anything like that. And at some point, like a couple months ago, there was this Harvard law professor who, I guess, tweeted out one of my episodes to his followers. He had a ton of followers, but it turns out that, and I appreciate that 100%. It turns out that he's a big uh, I don't want to say activist, but he's a sort of intellectual in a very conservative space.
Mhm.
And so when he like tweeted my my stream out, um, I got a ton of like followers who were like very conservative or very different
Yeah.
from anything else I'm following on Twitter. Um, and it's not that I just like, oh, I don't want to see anything conservative on Twitter. I kind of don't want to see anything like that on Twitter because like I said, it's more comfortable to see what
Right.
people who agree with you. Um, but it has led to this really weird thing where like I'll load up Twitter and it'll either be, you know, like that John Stuart Mill article, or it'll be like someone who's really upset and wants to overturn Roe versus Wade. And I'm like, this is a really strange thing. I don't think Twitter understands what I want to see anymore. Um,
Right. Like again, that's something that I notice is a pretty big problem on Twitter. Is that people there's a lot of wasted energy with how we go about things. Now, other people have recognized this, right? And they recognize that like, look, my followers agree with like 98% of what I say.
mhm,
So I'm just gonna shit post and make funny tweets about nothing. And oddly enough, I think a lot of these people are a step above the other category of sort of Twitter users that I see. The other thing that is hilarious is the random political accounts on Twitter that it's like it's always half the time it's always the same, and I agree with the sentiment. Like I think Julian Assange is a hero in a lot of ways, but it's like free Julian Assange, like a flower emoji, and they have these like names, and like their entire Twitter feed is like free Julian Assange again, like totally like right on, right?
right.
Or all of these things like Medicare for all now. It's like your entire followers are people who agree with the exact same thing. Like I get like I get that's fine if it makes you feel good, but that's exactly what it is. It's just something that makes you feel good. You're partaking in catharsis. You're not actually doing anything of substance. You're not again, some people I see this other also with sort of political content creators. They're like I'm an activist, and their activism in a lot of the ways exists digitally. Now, digital activism in a lot of ways I
Mhm,
would consider real, right? Oddly enough, we were talking about people like Julian Assange. That's a pretty good definition of digital activism. But what isn't digital activism is saying the same repetitive things in a certain place on the internet, and that's what happens, right? And then of course
right.
you get to another group of people where they're like, okay, they recognize the absurdity of what's going on with like random political accounts that tweet Medicare for all now, or like, Marx did, Marx said we should do X, thus we should do X. And it's like all these other people you follow also read Marx, or, like, a lot of other things. Like, I don't know what the fuck conservatives say. So I don't talk about conservatives a lot because I really like, I'm very far from that podium. But, it's, so you get these people who will like make the most weirdly postmodern shit posting sort of activities on the internet, and so something that I find there's a little bit of an internal tension. It's like, do I on the internet, do I partake in the weird postmodern like doomer post, or like
Right.
comedic sort of postmodern like just fucking around on Twitter having fun, or do I also take something seriously and try to contend with a very real community of people that are, they're human beings, they're behind a screen, but they're
Mhm.
human beings. So how do I balance the ability to try to get prescient points across while maybe not wasting too much time and energy, and maybe not spending a little bit of time to have fun. That's always the weird conundrum on Twitter that I find that uh people may be conscious of it, but I don't know. I don't know if you felt that way. I've always felt I'm in a tug of war here, right? I don't want
Oh,
to. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. I mean, that's the real problem, right? Is like, look, Twitter is great if you want to like make one-liners in 140 characters or less, like, and there are people that are really good at it.
Right.
And like, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that. Like, you know, I think there's a really healthy way to use Twitter, and it's sort of been knocking around in my head for a while. But if you just like assume that every single person is a bot, I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to
Yeah.
use Twitter. Um, but I also think like, like I said before, I think one of the problems with Twitter is that it sort of warps the goals of what you're doing.
Yeah.
So like, um, if we were talking, well, I mean, if I was talking with somebody on Twitter, in real life, and face to face, there are all sorts of norms where like we'd probably be more polite to each other, I would hope, and like probably try to understand each other a little more, I would hope. Not totally, but a little more than on the internet. Certainly more than like if it's some anonymous Twitter account. Um, but like, is it just a matter of picking and choosing?
Right.
I mean, it's difficult because like Twitter is in some ways really horrible, and I think creates a lot of echo chambers, not just bubbles, but if like you know an echo chamber being like in a technical sense, where like um, an echo chamber is like a sort of structure that ensures that people are like misallocating their trust, right?
Hmm.
So a bubble is where you just like don't see other opinions. So you follow a bunch of people and they all have the same opinion as you, and so like those get reinforced. But that's mostly because you're just like not following other people that disagree with you. An echo chamber, on the other hand, is a lot worse because you do see other opinions. So this could be like Alex Jones viewership or listenership, whatever it is that
Hmm.
he's doing these days, if he's doing anything at all, like maybe like Fox News viewers or like something like that, where you definitely encounter other opinions, but you just don't trust them across the board,
Right.
right? There's just no trust there. You only trust the people in the in group of the echo chamber, and so no matter what sort of alternate evidence you see, it just gets sort of incorporated into your worldview. And that's really hard to break out of. So
Right.
I think that's something that Twitter does like in spades for
Oh yeah.
sure. Um, but also like, I don't know, like I went onto YouTube and I was like, what is Baudrillard even saying? And I typed it into the search bar and I found your channel. And then I went on to Twitter and I was like, hey, do you want to do a collaboration and talk? So these sorts of things can also be platforms that do actually lead to genuine, sort of measured discussion where people are
Right.
trying to sort of understand things. And like, um, it's one of the things that I've sort of admired about the way that you run your channel is like, I think the videos are really good, but I also think like just, like having watched a bunch of your streams and having participated, like, you've cultivated an audience where they're just like very willing to sort of, I think, like take a breath and like just kind of think about what's going on and what you're saying and that sort of thing. And so it's a sort of double-edged sword. I don't know, I'm sort of at a loss of how to ensure it's one or the other,
Yeah.
like, but I don't know if you have any sort of experience with that,
No,
or
yeah. No, no,
I don't know.
no.
That's sort of inside baseball, so I don't want,
No, I appreciate it. No, the best compliment I think as a content creator I can get is that, damn, your audience is actually fucking nice to people, and they actually will like they're very much interested in hearing you out and understanding your humanity, because that's the ultimate compliment, and it's true. I honestly, you guys rule. I've been on programs, I've been on channels, and I say it all the time. It was only once, but it was like the most dumbfounding experience of my life. I went on a YouTube channel, and it was some really dumb fuck like debate. But I didn't want to go into it as a debate.
sure.
That wasn't the point. And the question was, is AOC a sellout? And essentially, I was like, okay, it doesn't matter if she's a sellout. At the end of the day, I was like, what a dumb, like this is a very, very, very surface question and means almost nothing with a lot of baggage there. And I got like 5 death threats. And so, like, if that's not an example of
Ouch.
an audience being as a as YouTube or as content spheres becoming a sort of um cathartic outlook and in pure entertainment. Like it almost goes beyond entertainment. I think it's actually like it's like libidinal meaning, right? Like going
Mhm.
on there and saying, guys, this isn't that important. It just completely, again, to quote a good friend, Plastic Pills and Victor, they've used this before. Like, dude, you interrupted their nut. I love that. I never thought about it that way. It's like you interrupted their nut, dude. They were about to
That's
climax. They were
fantastic.
about to fucking climax, and then you go in there and say, hey, what you guys are fucking doing really isn't like, it's not like, let's there's better things to focus on. Yeah, dude, they're about to climax, and I got in the fucking way. But that's how a lot of this shit functions. So, and just like
Mhm.
Twitter, like you said, with echo chambers, and there's only trust of this in group, and then everything becomes mechanically antagonistic afterwards, right? With any other, if there's, and it almost doesn't revolve around ideas half the time. It's like aesthetics. It's like, oh, this person said like, it's like almost an aesthetic notion, right? There's actually not an ideological disagreement going on per se. There's an aesthetic disagreement going on. You're not like, this is one of the biggest things with I saw a clip of Jimmy Dore. I thought this was wonderful. It's not even to shit on Jimmy Dore. It's just such a wonderful example of this. It's Jimmy Dore was like, so Ryan Grimm pretty much said something about like, I think, was it Nancy Pelosi getting caught insider trading? I think that's what it was.
Oh, she's got a big problem with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, big problem,
Just
right?
as a
This whole
just to
and
bracket that,
and I
yeah.
think Ryan Grimm, I think, wrote an article saying like, yeah, Nancy Pelosi caught insider trading and shit, and Jimmy Dore is like, this is propaganda. He was like, he didn't say motherfucking bitch got caught insider trading. He didn't say this horrid witch in Congress insider trading. He said Democrat Nancy Pelosi. He's like, this is how propaganda works. I'm like, this is beautiful. One of the greatest clips I've ever seen on the internet because it encompasses how this entire fucking thing works. It's not about like it's an aesthetic. It's like Ryan Grimm in this particular case didn't stick to the outrageous sort of angry aesthetic that maybe the crowd of Jimmy Dore feels, and then they create a certain like wormhole, ideological wormhole, where if you don't share that aesthetic, you don't share that certain use of language, you're out. You're an outcast. And it's just, I'm not even shitting. I'm not even, like, Jimmy Dore has nothing to do with it. I just thought that, I saw that clip. I was
Right.
like, dude, this is like the perfect example. Like this is, like, I thought it was beautiful. It was just the most perfect example I've ever seen. It was wonderful. It wasn't even something that upset me. I just thought I was like, I want to save this clip forever, and I'm gonna keep it in a little box, and it's gonna stay with me forever. And I'm just gonna show people. I'm like, this is how the internet functions. But no, that really is. There's a lot of libidinal release, ideological echo chambers, and it doesn't even come. We were talking about ideology. Half the time, it's almost like dumber than that, right? At least ideology is a bit complex in its approach.
Mhm.
It's like aesthetic. And that's where, like, ideology sucks, but we're dealing with something a little bit more complex with ideology, and there's respect there, right? We can respect that, like, okay, this is a complex issue. Aesthetics isn't, and still people are like tied to this aesthetic sort of approach to politics, and that, in my mind, that's dismal. Like, that's not even, I mean, that's depressing.
It
But
really is. I mean, and to put a fine point on it, like the I will, I'll never forget this. 'Cause there's studies, countless studies about this. The best one I think is the one about the Affordable Care Act, right? Where they, the they there was some survey that asked people what they thought about Obamacare, and then asked people what they thought about the Affordable Care Act, and just the change in the language. I mean, one, a lot of people didn't know they were the same thing, but two, you got like violently different reactions
yeah,
just when you used like the sort of uh like trigger word, almost like you used Obamacare and it got like a violent reaction out of Republican voters, and then you use the Affordable Care Act and they're like, yeah, I think it's great, like now I can have healthcare.
yeah.
um
You know what's
and
weird about
and
that? That
yeah.
just made I just thought about this. I don't know if you knew this. Joe Biden's favorability rating is like super fucking high compared to prior
Hmm.
presidents. Isn't that fucking bizarre? Yeah, I mean, like he's very like that. Like that is such a, I think what we're talking about. Like that's such a good definition. Joe Biden fits a sort of aesthetic that conservatives, and I don't even talk about visual aesthetics. I'm talking about rhetorical aesthetics, you know how they talk. It fits. It doesn't. People are they're not as angry, but something like Obamacare, right? The ACA, that
Right.
doesn't work, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are huge problems with it,
Yeah.
but like
No, no,
the
no, no.
point is that
I mean, they're okay, right? They're like the
Mhm.
rhetorical positioning of having Obama on the ACA, Obamacare.
Sure,
They
yeah,
don't like
yeah.
that, right? I just think that
Right.
I think that's so bizarre. I never would have expected Joe Biden to be as popular as he is. Although that may be a four-sided opinion. I thought he would actually be a pretty unpopular president, but he's really popular, and that's a really weird shit happens.
Well, and yeah, I mean, look, I agree with that for sure. I mean, like, if you told me when the primary was going on and he was getting crushed in the early Democratic primary by pretty much everyone,
Yeah,
what was going to happen, I would not have anticipated. Well, I mean, maybe I should have anticipated what actually ended up
yeah,
happening, but you wouldn't have thought that he would have been some amazing president,
right.
or I guess I should say more accurately, a very well loved president. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's that language plays such a huge role in these sorts of echo chamber type systems, um, because if nothing else, they tell you who is in and who is out,
Right.
right? Like, um, I'm trying to think of a good example. I was reading like an article on this, and they were talking about, God, what is his name? Rush Limbaugh, and how he would like basically invent his own language, right? And it would like enter the Republican and the conservative vernacular. And like you could tell, right? This was like one of the ways that they could tell, you were on our team or you were against our team or whatever it was. Um, and that sort of in-group, out-group is really important. I think one of the things that it does also is like, and you mentioned this, is it sort of short circuits the part of your brain that is like, hey, conversation is about like coming to meet another person, like another human being, another person halfway in a certain respect, right? Like having a certain respect for them, having a certain compassion for them to understand where they're coming from. Um, it's just completely short circuits that. It's dehumanizing in that sense as well. Um, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a confusing space, I think, because there's not a lot of theory that really, at least sort of, I guess, I don't know. I hate using like the analytic continental thing,
Yeah,
right?
me too.
But
Yeah.
dude, I don't know. My background is more on like the analytic side, I guess. And well, first off, your great example. Um, I feel like stuff on the continental side, or at least maybe like the analytics side, does terrible with this. Is like examples are terrible. Like I
Yeah.
can't tell you how many times I'm like reading some paper and it's like, making some point in analytic metaphysics or something, and they're like, and an example like the cat on the mat. I'm like, why would you use that example? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't illustrate anything. Like, can't you use some better example? And like, I don't know. I think like the political theorists on the more continental side of things, like the critical theorists and things like that, they have such a good grasp on how to use excellent illustrative real world examples. It's something that I like kind of envy, from their
Yeah.
tradition. Um,
That's something I get really irritated with the whole continental analytical divide, albeit my understanding, maybe I'm a little biased because I've definitely already firmly planted my feet in kind of the continental field. But I do like analytical philosophy a lot. Like every time, I haven't read a lot of analytical philosophy, but the little bits that I do, I actually enjoy it. It's something different. It's a very structured way of looking at things. Um, and I actually kind of it's a nice little change to have. I've never felt antagonistic towards it, but my understanding was like is actually like logical positivists, right? It was the sort of positivist in that sort of field of philosophy that really it was a pretty aggressive push that like continental philosophers were not philosophers. They can't be because it's not rigorous enough, and so they sort of they left to literature departments, and that's what it makes sense. And with making examples with continental philosophy, there is a creative spirit that analytical doesn't have. And this creative spirit, I think, is one of the founding reasons why I value continental philosophy so much, is that I think that the best philosophy is one that creates. And that's not all philosophy. Like a lot of philosophy, the goal is to like just clarity, right? To clear things up, to grant
Right.
some like information. And that's great. That's wonderful. That is very useful. But there's something about like actual fundamental creation or how to create or like these newer sets of newer ways to go about things. And of course, in the tradition of continental philosophy, I think a professor, he was I did a political philosophy class. He's one of the only professors I got to interact with in my university's philosophy department. He kind of said like theory. He's a big fan of theory. I think he's a big Deleuzian Deleuze person. But he says continental philosophy in theory is so wonderful because they can do so much groundwork really fast. They can come up with these really creative, very presciently accurate ideas very, very quick, much quicker than analytical philosophers. There's one problem, though. They can run the risk of being really fucking wrong. And analytical philosophers, on the other end, they don't do shit for the longest times, but most of the time, there's like a set pattern and there's like a consistency to what they're doing. Analytical philosophy is all over the fucking place, right? And you're going to hit the mark and
Absolutely.
you're going to miss the mark really big. Analytical philosophy, not so much. It's like, you'll hit the mark and you'll miss the mark by small margins, if that makes sense, you know?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see it like, I don't know, just like on the analytic side, like the turn of the 20th century, you have like this sort of linguistic turn. People want to just talk about language. You get like very, sort of incremental, tiny baby steps. And then all of a sudden, like, you know, Saul Kripke comes out with naming a necessity, and people sort of just like wash their hands of it almost and like
Yeah.
um, decide to maybe move on a little bit. But yeah, I think like one of the most fascinating sort of readings I ever did for a course was like I had a seminar that did a class on like the conflict, I guess conflict, the argument between uh Heidegger and Carnot. And that was just like fascinating. It was like distilling the whole, argument of analytic versus continental into like two
Wow.
readings, and it was really fascinating stuff.
That would be a
Um,
very fascinating class. That
yeah. So I've read some continental stuff. I've read a little Sartre. I've read a little, like Heidegger. Um, I don't know. And then it gets weird. Like the lines get blurry, right? Like I took a seminar on Kant, and Kant is like sort of
yeah.
before what you would think of as
Mhm.
continental, but sort of in that tradition and sort of writes a little bit in that
I
tradition, but is
think
also
that's
very analytic.
right, exactly. I think that's why Kant is so popular. I think is and he's sort of like the founding philosopher. Like Kant really is like I don't know, it's funny people, Marx was writing at the time of German idealism is like Hegel is the fucking he's the mainstream, he's the
Right.
hegemonic thinker. Dude, holy fuck. I feel like in so many ways like Kant was it and like he's always been it since then. In some ways, not every way, but no, that's right. Kant is like the perfect definition of someone that kind of just precedes that divide perfectly and uses both. And of course, every philosopher before the analytical continental divide, which I think that divide didn't that roughly happen at the beginning of the 20th century? Is that right? Like when we
Yeah, I
could
mean, I
start, yeah.
I generally think of it like, if you want to put like a hard start on it, I typically think of like Frege, Bertrand Russell as being like really getting it going.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
which is funny because Frege is German, so I don't know what to think of that. But
Mhm.
um, yeah, and then it's sort of, like all through. Well, and then it's like weird because then you have like Wittgenstein is writing sort of in that continuity almost, but
Yeah.
he is like certainly not. I mean, he's like analytic in a certain sense. He's like engaging with the topics that analytic philosophers are engaging with, but he is, I mean, to read Wittgenstein is like absolute practice.
Yeah.
It's very difficult and very much it's almost like reading like Nietzsche or something. It's like you have to sort of pore over every single sentence and try to figure out what the hell he's even talking about.
Right. I haven't
Um,
read Wittgenstein. I would really like to, but I've heard that before. It's funny. I was listening to back when I had time, when I was still on university and campus wasn't closed due to COVID and
mhm.
shit. Listening to the Plastic Pills podcast on Nietzsche, and it's like it was hilarious. Their universal conclusions, like, yeah, Nietzsche's a great, approachable, really easy philosopher to read. And roughly at that point, I was reading Nietzsche, especially The Birth of Tragedy and parts of Beyond Good and
Yeah,
Evil. And I was like,
right.
what the fuck are you talking about? This shit's granted. I realized there was two different translations. I was really dumb and I got the hardest one, like ridiculously difficult. There's other translations
Gotta
that
go.
are yeah, and but
Apparently,
it's
that's what
funny
I'm
though
told.
because when you get to it, no, they're actually right in some ways. Nietzsche is actually a little easy in many ways. Heidegger was pretty fucking tough for me. Uh, yeah, who else? Spinoza was. I had a pretty tough time following Spinoza a lot. Granted, the older philosophy that you read, it can kind of tend to be that way. But
Oh, absolutely.
Hegel is fucking ridiculous. But yeah, no, this shit's hard to read, man.
It's a whole different and as somebody coming from I mean, my experience in philosophy has been the sort of standard, US department that'll give you, some continental stuff, but mostly the sort of Western canon.
Hmm.
Um, it's a whole different language. I
It
mean,
is.
even Kant, I was like, I took this seminar this past semester on his first critique, the critique of pure reason. And yeah, that's probably one of his biggest, hardest books. But at the same time, I'm like, half of the slog is just trying to learn a new language. And it's very difficult in that way and becomes very interpretive in that way. Um, but yeah, I mean, like Spinoza, I think is fascinating. I haven't read. Really should read more Spinoza. I Most of what I've read about Spinoza, actually, interestingly enough, is about like his theory of mind,
Hmm.
which I find absolutely fascinating and far more plausible than like the competing theories at the time. Um, so Spinoza thought that, well, he disagreed with Descartes. Descartes
Right.
had, his theory of mind was very like you sort of move through the world and you encounter
Other bodies and
propositions and yeah, and you can sort of, the way that we come to knowledge is we sort of encounter a proposition and then we deliberate on it. Is it true? Is it not true? And then we can accept it or reject it. But Spinoza was very much the opposite. Spinoza was like, look, we just sort of go through the world and accept the things that we see. Almost automatically.
hmm
And then it's the later process of rejection that where we might sort of cultivate our knowledge and cultivate our beliefs. Um, and there's actually like a lot of empirical evidence for that.
hmm
That's more contemporary. And this was one of my, this was to go back to this paper I'm working on critiquing Mill. A part of the critique is like from this sort of Spinozan perspective, where it's like it's hard to think that the marketplace of ideas works unless we sort of assume an underlying Cartesian framework for thinking.
That's a really good point. I never thought about it like that. But no, I really, I've always, dude, it's no secret. I absolutely love Spinoza. Like, I really like Spinoza a lot. I think he, out of all modern philosophers, like modern as that point, like maybe pre-Kant,
Mhm.
I think Spinoza is probably the most correct. It's really weird. There's a lot of people who actually like there's still a lot of people today that reject Spinoza in favor of Descartes, and that is mind-boggling to me. Like that, like I think like I don't know your position because Spinoza is very contrary to Descartes, especially with a sort of unified nature of things and a monism, and Descartes is a dualist. I
Right.
don't. Like I'm like Spinoza at least on so many levels, like metaphysically as well. Like it just it's you know I don't know, man. You can't. I find it incredibly difficult to argue against, but I quite like it a lot. Like his theory of mind is very interesting, and it's like there's not this rigid separation of like again, like Spinoza in a lot of ways like precedes like almost Marx's materialism in some ways. I mean, that's why I also another weird Twitter interaction. I've also seen Spinoza be called a liberal idealist. I'm like, that is the most like Spinoza is a
What?
material. Yeah, Spinoza is a materialist in every definition of the word. Yeah, the process of learning and mind comes from like actual interaction and like a body of
Hmm.
force, and like of course Deleuze really emphasizes this of like movement and speed. Like it's interaction,
Right.
movement, and speed. And you think about that from a philosophical concept, you're like, okay, whatever, dude. No, but like actually at a scientific level, this fascinating part,
Yeah,
dude.
that's so
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, dude, this motherfucker is like 1600s, and he's like, like think about mountains. Mountains are doing the same thing. They're moving. There's a process of speed going on, just much slower than humans who are building towns and shit and like walking and stuff.
Right.
It's like
Right.
it is a process of interaction, relationship, and speed. And it's like I think once you kind of like I think once I really like thought about that and learned it and really pondered I haven't been able to find anything to ever replace anything like that. Like process ontology, in my mind, it's just the only ontology that I can actually really kind of subscribe to.
Yeah. I mean, that's all extremely fascinating. Like,
Hmm.
and I guess the first thing I'd say is like, I I love Descartes in the way that I love Mill, which is
Sure.
that
Yeah.
like I don't think he's right about everything. I don't expect him to be right about everything after all these years. But I think there's just like so much we can learn from him, and like even just as like a sort of cog in the dialectic machine, right? Like you
Right.
need to read Descartes, and it's funny
Hmm.
because like when people ask me like where should I start with philosophy, I always talk about, or I always suggest that people start with Meditations on First Philosophy,
Hmm.
because I think it's sort of it's clear enough for a beginner. It's clear enough, I think, to be your anybody's first philosophy text. Um, but it's rich enough where like you can keep coming back to it, and even if you read it, as your first text, and as a in an intro to philosophy course or something like that, you could make a career as a professor about it. You know what I mean? Like it's that rich a text. But it also sort of showcases the method that came to dominate philosophy. And even like, so I don't know, like back then, if you think about it historically, Descartes was a philosopher, but he was also like a mathematician
Hmm.
and a scientist. And like back then, there wasn't such a sharp distinction between these different fields, which is something that, as an aside, I think is like a huge problem with philosophy these days.
Uh-huh.
But um, yeah, I just think like his method of argumentation and like building up from first principles, this sort of mathematical style of proof. Um, I mean, it's still the way that people are taught to write philosophy today, at least in the more analytically minded departments. And so I just think it's like such a good place to start. I mean,
It
even if you
is.
disagree with everything he says, which I think most people are going to disagree with most of what he says, because
Hmm.
he is a substance dualist that thinks that our our immaterial souls interact with our bodies through a the pineal gland in the brain, which
Hmm.
like I mean you can't take the substance of that claim seriously, but um it's an excellent place to start. So in that respect, I think I need to read more Spinoza, honestly, but I would probably find myself more in the camp that you're in, where I mean, no, very few contemporary philosophers of mind are dualists of any sort, let alone substance dualists.
Right.
Um, most people, my understanding is that most of them are, and not that this is like, argumentatively important or anything like that, but most philosophers of mind, my understanding is that they're physicalists, that they want to just say, well, look, the mind is just, whatever. However it turns out, it's the way that physics, because it's going to describe it. I don't know what that is, but that's the way it's going to be. And so that seems much more in line with the way that Spinoza describes things. But I think like to tie it back to sort of our topic for today, like just being open to these sorts of ideas and not coming to them with the sort of mindset that there's not that there's so much at stake, but just that like I don't want to engage with it unless I think it's substantially correct.
Right.
Um, because it's like you say, like the dialectic is important. It's important to know where we've come from in terms of our knowledge and where we can go with it. Um, and it's important like to understand later philosophers, right? Like I think like if you want to understand Marx, you're gonna have to understand, the
Hegel and
sort of
yeah.
yeah, the English economists that he was reading and reacting to. So
Right. Yeah, yeah, I was kind of detailing I remember one day I made a tweet. Well, one day what happened was I was in the the philosophy, or not the philosophy. I was in the subreddit for r/communism, and someone made a like book recommendation to get into Marx, and I said go read an introductory book on Hegel. It would help a lot, and then like read that introduction book to Hegel, and then from there like it'll make understanding Marx and what he's talking about, and critiquing in a lot of ways, like the German ideology. He critiques the shit out of young Hegelians. It'll make it easier to
cool.
understand. And I got banned from. I got fucking banned. I still laugh about it to this day. I got
Oh
banned for
man.
it for suggesting to read Hegel. But no. That's totally right. To understand a certain field of philosophy is to inform yourself from the outside. That's why, like, I think like even political strategy. I talk about like the best way to inform political strategies to actually learn from the outside is actually to escape politics, because
Hmm.
politics and whatever you are learning within any certain subfield can become alienating, right? It becomes fixated and
Right.
it's not informed on the outside, if that makes sense. And uh no, like understanding someone like Descartes, that's incredibly important. Especially if you want to understand a lot of the philosophical canon moving forward. But no, that's yeah, I and in some ways the wormhole of echo chambers, we're talking about internet echo chambers. We're expanding on that. We're looking at philosophical echo chambers in some ways as
Yeah,
well.
I mean we've gone into the weeds, I guess you could say. But I think it's all like it all comes back to the same thing that you said at the very beginning, I think, which is it's really about cultivating a certain way of knowing, a certain way of trying to
Right.
understand things. And that's why a lot of times, like, I'll be honest, like when I see stuff on the internet that, is almost angry, right? You see like these critiques of Mill or something, and they're like angry, or these, leftists who are critiquing liberal theory, and they're like like really hostile about it. It's to me a little strange because I think like the better attitude to take to it is that like, look, you know, it's we're all trying to understand what's going on essentially. And that's sort of the reason why we end up doing philosophy anyway, or doing theory anyway, is like, I think Marx probably had a lot of reasons for why he was writing what he was writing, but one of them was to like try to come to understand what's happening around him, right? As the world is changing, as capitalism is ramping up, like all of these things. And so like I don't ever really want to hold it against anybody if their experiences have led them to understand the world in a certain way.
Right.
I think it's much more fruitful to come to it, I mean, to put a really fine point on it, with an open mind, and to say, look, their experience is different. Maybe I can learn something from that. It seems like a truism, but I don't think that very often it happens. So yeah, I'm often very very almost confused about how people get so up in arms. And I guess I shouldn't be, because there's definitely a moral component. Like if you are and I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely like I'll say this, I'm on the left. I'm farther left than a lot of my friends are.
Mhm.
Um and so I understand like the sort of moral imperative that is underlying a lot of this theory, right? I mean, it's not just theory about what's going on, it's theory about like active exploitation of people in the real world. Um, and so I like I said, I 100% understand like why people would get upset about it and get angry about it, and get motivated in that way. Um, but it's sort of an interesting dichotomy that almost needs to be drawn between like sort of legitimate moral outrage and what is going to be a useful political strategy, or almost like just a strategy within the community wherever you are moving forward to fix those problems.
Right. No, I mean that. No, I think that's no, that's definitely right. Right. Like what happens is, again, this goes back to even like debate, right? Or an exchange of information is an exchange of information isn't really what's happening, right? You're half the
Right.
time there is a sort of unconscious libidinal response to when people counteract what you say, because you're disrupting the symbolic ethos of one's life and belief. And that's a serious thing, and that should be taken seriously, right? We don't take it seriously, right? We are very much ingrained Western liberals, right? It is a tradition to do so, but in many ways there isn't a lot of respect in that regard, and you run into a lot of baseless antagonism and an almost sort of metal shield around your soul, if you will, right? That you forget these people are people. You forget people behind the computer screens. It's that's kind of I don't know if you knew. I went on Vosh about a month ago on his stream, and one of the things that I was kind of trying to make like the point to him and his audience is like, it's not that like Vosh is some mean human being, but Vosh
Mhm.
interacts. Vosh is actually very, very nice, and in a very authentic way to me, anyways.
Right.
You can tell when people are really nice and it's fake. I never got that from
Sure.
Vosh. Like Vosh is very, very nice. His community was very, very nice too, which I didn't expect his community to be shit, but they were very, very kind, very like unexpectedly so. Nonetheless, I went on there because they're involved in this sort of rigid debate sphere on how
Mhm.
on this exchange of information, and kind of like what I try to say is like, debate can often really like alienate more than it communicates, right? More than it informs, and when you alienate someone, like you lose the ability to inform, if that really is your goal. If that is your goal, I think even having the idea of just like, oh, my goal is to inform, I think that's a little bit of a rigid construct to live by. I think that's very stressful, but nonetheless a lot of us do that, and it comes from a very altruistic, very good sort of point, like a very responsible thing, like, oh, like some X idea is fruitful in my life, I need to spread this idea, whatever. So it comes from a good place, but it can alienate, and we forget the human behind the computer screen, we forget the human behind the cell phone, whatever. And I think at the core, before we do almost anything, I think that's something that I'll probably I try to live by, and I try to hold and wear on my sleeve, you know?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's like, I don't know, it's something that really frustrates me. Is just like, I think that a lot of people forget that politics is, at least in part, I would hope, about like compassion and about like, it's not necessarily about converting people to your view forcefully through argument. It's about learning how we can live, it's the art or the science of how we can live together.
Mhm.
Um, and that's going to come with compromise probably, and that's going to come with sort of a requirement to meet people halfway, but ultimately it's going to require that we treat other people as people, particularly um when we're trying to engage in discourse about these really important questions. um like, I think it's a good example, but like the and I mean, this might be not a great example to bring up online, but one of the topics that got me into philosophy as an undergrad was the debate around abortion,
Mm.
because
Mhm.
I entered my intro to ethics class as a good left-leaning college student, and I was like, there is no way that anybody can sway me on this issue. Like this week we're doing the abortion debate, and there's no way anybody could do it. Um,
Colonialism must
and
always
I
be
read,
included
I
in
don't know if you're
discussions of
or if
capitalism.
your listeners are
Mhm.
familiar, but there's a really famous paper. Um, I'm forgetting who wrote it. It's it basically it's a paper about abortion. I think it might be Judith Jarvis Thompson, but she
Oh,
writes
I think
about
yeah, I think I know what you're
the
talking about.
violinist.
I think I know what you're referring to.
Yeah, so it's a really famous paper about abortion that was really influential, and it sort of presents this thought experiment about a violinist. Like, you wake up one day and the violinist is like attached to you essentially, and the doctors tell you, the violinist is going to die unless, you keep him attached to you for 9 months. It's supposed to
Right.
be a I guess a sort of comparison to the abortion debate. Obviously, Thomas argues uh, you can remove the violinist. You have no obligation to this violinist, so you're totally ethically fine in removing the violinist, and that's fine. And I read this paper, and I was like, absolutely, this is 100% true, and surely no one will sway me in any other direction. Um, but then we read another paper, right? And this was like, I was very new to philosophy, and I was new to the sort of dialectic process that a lot of this happens in. And it wasn't a paper necessarily arguing that Thompson was wrong, but it was a paper that argued, well, look, we might be, it might be okay to remove the violinist, but really all we're justified in doing is separating, right? The violinist actually dying is a whole separate issue, and
Mhm.
it's not clear that that's okay. And
Right.
I remember sitting there and being like, I had never even thought about it. And it's sort of this, to go back to one of your earlier points, like it's sort of like this expansion of your mind, right? Where you're like, wow, I didn't even know that I could that people could articulate some argument in this way or look at this issue in this way. Um, and it's not even that I came out of that class like, "Oh, wow, I don't know if it's right, right or wrong." I'm still obviously very much on the side that it should be legal and accessible, but maybe it's more complicated, and maybe I don't always know all the facets of some issue before it comes up, or I really look into it, or something like that. I think people take a lot for granted, and um, they don't necessarily take an attitude towards their own beliefs as fallible. And I think that's a huge part of open-mindedness. However, people want to understand it is that like it's an attitude that you don't necessarily have towards other people or other ideas, but it's an attitude you have towards yourself where you understand that your opinions are fallible, that you might not be correct, that you might not understand the issue in its totality or something like that. Um, so yeah, it's kind of a complicated question of like, I mean, maybe
Think you're describing
open-mindedness.
you're describing the problem with a positivism, a continual reinforcement of something, right? Like that
Yeah,
something is
yeah.
100% and we know this. I think it's one of the worst. One of the I, I think I don't think there's a lot of universally bad things, but I think something that gets close to that is positivism, right? That there is this sort
Mhm.
of like presence of something or like where we can articulate something 100% and something is as is. I
Right.
have quite a big I have a big problem with that. And that can be a problem anywhere, you know.
Absolutely.
Um
Absolutely.
so I was going to say, dude, this has been a wonderful discussion. I think we're roughly running. I think we went over. We're like an hour and a half. But this is a wonderful talk, man. We'll probably actually cut it around here, if that's cool with you.
Sure, that's fine
Dude,
on my
it
end.
it was a ton of fun. You'll have to come on again, and also thank you for always, I've seen like you've been in chat a lot, so again, I appreciate you being a viewer and always hanging out.
Oh, for sure, man. Like I said, like I found your channel. I've been really impressed, not only with the videos, but like I said, like your viewership is great, and it's something that I hope to cultivate on my end as
Yeah,
well. So, it's always a pleasure to sort of be in chat and be conversing with people who are sort of ready to really just engage with the ideas and sort of
definitely.
take things seriously.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for like, taking the time to talk, and we got to do it again sometime.
Definitely, definitely do. So is there to give you a little shout out, is there anywhere people can find you?
For sure. So yeah, my I have a YouTube channel. That's where most of my stuff happens. It's Biblio99. So you can just search that. That'll come up. I do a live stream every week on a different topic in philosophy or law. I do, like could be like philosophy of mind, or it could be, constitutional law, whatever, we're talking about that week. I'm always open to like suggestions. So if folks have anything they want to talk about, I'm always, willing to sort of talk about what the people want, give them what they want. Yeah, they can find me on Twitter at Biblio99. I just actually launched a website as well, Biblio99.com. So you can check that website to see, uh, you know, future scheduled shows if you want to like check stuff in advance or things like that. But
Cool.
yeah, that's about the long and the short of it.
All right, man. Well, I will leave links to all of those things down in the description below. Probably head out of the Discord. I'll hang out with my chat for a little bit, and then our stream as well will probably end. But thank you so much for being on here, dude. It was a ton of fun. And again, I always really like talking to people who are able to go outside of typical frames of discussion and all that terrible stuff.
I mean, for sure. I mean, it's one of the great things, like, uh, doing these streams has been great relative to like grad school because, I mean, grad school is, a particular type of person is in those seminars, right? So it's
Mhm.
always great to get people with different backgrounds, different experiences who make the discussion way richer. So,
Definitely. Well, dude, I'm gonna head on out of here. Thank you again. It was always it was a fun time.
yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Awesome. See you, dude. All right, guys. That was a ton of fun. I like that. I know Biblio is always hung out and chat a lot. And he proposed to get together, have a discussion. I know he streams and stuff. I haven't been able to check out a lot of his stuff, but I will definitely have to do so. And we'll leave all those links down below. Be sure, guys, check him out, subscribe to him. Obviously, the dude's super cool, very, very knowledgeable. Um, w- Super easy to talk with. That's one of the biggest things. There's not a lot of baggage when you approach discussion with people, and there's all kinds of weird baggage. It's horribly uncomfortable. But Bandy, Gammy, who Biblio99. So we had a couple donations. I hope he's still here, he or she. They asked the $5 donation. I always want to be able to get to these. When I do streams, guys, with people, I can't always answer the question right off the bat. I would love to, but I will always find a way if you guys donate. Always try my best to, if you donate with a question, I'll always answer it. So Fake Coffee said, now that Amazon HQ2 is being built, I did not know that. And they are making their own apartments. I didn't know that either. That sucks. Or it's at least kind of scary. Well, maybe not that big of a deal. Sorry. Oh, you're about to go to work. Sorry about that, guys. How close do you think we are of corporations owning cities? Well, to be fair, they already do, and they have. The sort of lifeline of cities are corporations now, right? Like, for example, I actually, oddly enough, a little bit of a personal experience with this. Me and my fiance went to St. Louis recently. I live in the Kansas City area. I live in KC, and so we went to St. Louis, which is about a 4-hour drive east. And I've been to St. Louis numerous times, but now St. Louis feels like Detroit in the 1980s. It is a city in degradation, big time. Kansas City is an up and coming city. St. Louis used to be a really big city. It was a jumping off point to the west. Ironically enough, Kansas City also was, even though it's further west. But I didn't like shit's bad in St. Louis, and it's actually kind of bad because corporations have left. Budweiser's headquarters was in St. Louis, obviously for the longest time, and it's gone. And a lot has changed. The St. Louis Rams are now the L.A. Rams. And corporations clearly, like, I thought about that while I was there, is like shit. There's been a lot of other corporations and a lot of headquarters that have left St. Louis, and the city was it was different from what I remember it. Not only that, where we were a lot of the time was their Union Station. They have a very nice guys. Their Union Station is huge, and historically speaking, St. Louis would make sense because, again, it was a hopping off point for the West, and it's giant. It's bigger than Kansas City's. Kansas City's Union Station is much nicer and much better in every way, but it's not as big. St. Louis's used to be phenomenal. When I was young, we went to their Union Station in like probably mid 2000s. I was pretty young, but it was giant. It was sprawling. There was stuff all over there. There were shops there. It's gone. Like we went there and there was nothing there almost. Like it was like empty. There were shops closed. There was just it's weird. So we're already to the point where like they own cities, but maybe in a more official capacity, like you're saying, like a single corporate city, like one city. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's probably going to be a thing in the near future. I can't say it's like going to be much worse, you know, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if there's some like corporate cult that pops up. That would be fascinating and terrible. And then so I hope that kind of answers that question. Colonialism must always be included in discussions of capitalism. Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, like, you know, if there's one marking of capitalism, is that it does necessitate a sort of colonial apparatus, in a number of ways, right? And it evolves. Today, it's more like globalism, which is a more official colonialism, right? It may not be the sort of exploitative colonialism we saw with, say, well, like directly violent, if that makes sense. I mean, it is still violent, but you'll know what I mean when I compare it. But what is it? Leopold's Congo, Free State of Congo, is that right? I think it was Belgium. Some of the most heinous, like practically like genocide, like slavery compounds, and that was colonialism in my mind. That's the most visceral. It's the most visceral definition or visual of colonialism. But colonialism today is like it's a network of like interactions between states, and it's actually more elastic today, and in some ways it could be seen as more harmful. So yeah, I mean that is like capitalism and colonialism are very close. They're close buddies. What really is the difference between a corporation implicitly having complete control of a city versus them having the legal means to do so? Yeah, I think that's like almost a Marxist point, you know, and a good one, right? It's like, even though we don't have the official like title of a corporate city, it's how they operate, you know. Colonial era was also globalism, right? Well, I'm speaking of globalism as like post 1990s, like globalism, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, globalism is we've been a global species for some time now, but the official historical title of globalism, if that makes sense. Seeing their hand on the lever and suffering the aftermath compared to not seeing it, and just yeah. So yeah, a lot of stuff. Biblio99 chat. Hey, thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks, Epoch. Absolutely, dude. Thank you for coming on. It was a fun time. Let's see. So yeah, guys, I think that might wrap it up. I think, what is it, 4 o'clock? Might spend a couple more hours after this. I'll do some more scripting for our next video, and I'll call it a day, I think. But I'll call it a day for this stream. It was a ton of fun. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, David. Fresh Coffee. I think is it Fake Coffee, not Fresh Coffee? Fake Coffee for the donations, guys. Always helps a ton. Something else I always give at the end of the streams as well. Guys, I really couldn't do any of this without patrons. Just the way my channel operates. I made a YouTube post. I hope, you know, if it makes sense. I kind of boned myself, you know. The way our YouTube channel operates is it's a very unprofitable YouTube channel because of I have longer format videos, rather than frequent videos. The YouTube algorithm likes that a lot more. Um, and yeah, so it's always necessary for me to live on this site with patrons. It always sucks asking for money. But if you guys could spare a couple bucks a month, I offer some perks. Again, I always try to be flexible with perks. Like, guys, like if you pledge $3 a month to me and you see something in the $6 tier that you want, like some exclusive content or anything like that, just let me know. And I will work with you completely. Try to be lenient. Like even like giving a little money to me is like enough. Like that's already kind of a big deal to me. So yeah, definitely need that in order to survive. I couldn't do it without any of you guys. Any of you guys who are patrons, thank you so much, like genuinely. And even people who cannot, thank you for being here. Like it's always a pleasure doing these things. Other than that, if you guys do shop on Amazon, I do, don't do it because I have an affiliate link at all. They suck. But if you do, and you're like me and you can't escape it, consider using and bookmarking our Amazon link. It should be in the chat below. And it gives me a small percentage of whatever you buy, right? So if you buy from them, might as well use a content creator's affiliate link. If you're using someone else's, totally cool. But if you're not, maybe consider bookmarking ours and just using it online on Google or wherever on your computer whenever you buy stuff. It helps out a little bit. So yeah. All right, guys. I'm probably gonna head on out of here. It's been fun. It's been real. I hope to see you soon. We probably schedule some stream later this week, I think. So yeah. All right, guys. I will talk to you later. I'm gonna go script